Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. Today, we are back with a special guest episode, a non-therapist, but somebody who is totally doing the work and helping people out, which I love to get other perspectives here. Somebody whose work I followed for a while, and I'm excited to finally get to connect with. I am joined by the host of White Homework, the co-host of Go Home Bible, You're Drunk, a fairly large figure in the ex-evangelical community, I would say. Tori Williams Douglass is my guest today. Tori, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm really excited to be here. This is awesome. I love it. I love the premise.
You made a bit of a face at a fairly large figure in the ex-evangelical community.
I never know what to do with that. People are like, "You're famous," and like this one part of Twitter, back when it was Twitter, and
Yeah.
I'm always like, "Am I okay?" I don't know. I don't know how to measure such a thing, right? So it just feels like this really interesting. It feels so abstract to me, but then I'll like if I go to a talk or a conference or whatever, people like walk up to me and they're like, "Hey."
It is weird. My podcast is smaller than yours, so again, I have a margin of this, but I'm 6'3". I look like what white people want Jesus to look like. And so, like, I coach volleyball. So a lot of times I'll go into a gym and people recognize me. My nickname is Volleyball Jesus. And so, like, I stand out. And it's weird. It's weird when people recognize you, or people be like, I've heard your voice before when I talk at conferences, and be like, oh, my podcast. Sure.
Yeah.
But, like, it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, honestly, I'm pretty okay with it, but it is really funny because I'll like, if I go like drop my kids off at camp and I'll come home and I'm like, I have DMs from people who are like, oh, I listened to your podcast. I saw you dropping your kid off. I hope this isn't weird. And it's like, no, it's not weird. It's fine. Everybody who like actually listens to me is a very cool person. So,
Yeah, I think I vibe well with the neurodivergent. So I always say like I get a lot of neurodivergent guests because neurodivergent brains find each other.
Okay. Yeah, we do. What's that about? I love that about us. It makes me feel very seen. You just sort of gravitate towards people who.
Yeah, I think it's a general comfort with not following social norms. If I had to probably oversimplify it.
I love that.
Yeah.
I've never been good at following social norms or picking up on them, which I think that's part of why I didn't do so well in evangelicalism. Like there are so many layers to it, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of rules. Yeah, let's talk about that if you don't mind. Maybe doing the Cliff Notes version of your evangelical journey into being a anti-racist educator and podcaster and public speaker now. Can you give us sort of the abridged Cliff Note version?
Absolutely. This is not what they would have said the Lord's plan for my life was. I'll just say that. And I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I attended like evangelical kind of charismatic churches, like non-denominational. I was homeschooled K through 12. Portland is very white. Non-denominational charismatic churches in Portland are in the outlying areas are very white. So we were very consistently like the only Black kids or like kids of any color at all, depending on where we were going to church. And so all of that was a little bit strange. And then add on top of that I'm like non-binary, have no understanding of what gender means at all for other people. Like I know other people perceive and like feel a gender, and I'm just like, what does that mean? I don't get it. Like I love that for you, and it's still like jarring. I have a friend who has this like line of merch that has this like very like pro woman, pro feminist sort of like loving being a woman, and I'm just like, this is so beautiful. I don't know what you're talking about. Never felt like I wanted to be anything other than myself. Never really felt the need to fit in. I didn't pick up on those unspoken, not only the social cues, but like the Christian like the evangelical cues. I didn't get it. Right. And so I would hear sermons about like Eve in the Garden of Eden and how she was responsible for like all of this pain and suffering and sin and whatever. And I would just be like, they're women, other women, right, in the space, and people who are coded female were, I think, supposed to feel bad. And I was just like, this is a weird story, you guys. I don't think it means this. I just went right over my head. You know, they're trying to make me feel shame about stuff. And I'm just like, okay, I guess I feel bad. And so I just wasn't the right like cookie cutter sort of mold to be an evangelical for very long. So I'm not.
Yeah. And I'm curious, sort of in the timeline, like where your neurodivergence came from, like not where it came from. Obviously it was there the whole time, but like when did you get diagnosed? Sort of how did that fit in?
Okay. That is a really good question. I would say I was like officially diagnosed with ADHD in 2015. I have the weirdest possible story about that. The most ADHD story actually of all time. Kind of already gave away the the jump, but like, do you remember lockdown, like the beginning of lockdown for the pandemic? I don't know where you live, if your state like shut down in Oregon, like nothing was happening. Like there were no public things. And I was like it was probably like May. And I called up my doctor and I was just like, I have no executive function. I don't know what is happening. I can't execute on anything beyond like a single task every day. And then I need the rest of the day to recover. I don't know what's going on here. And I was like, can I just like get a screening so that we can talk about like getting me medicated? I'd been on Zoloft for several years at that point for anxiety. And so anyway, this like took forever because I was not the only person calling a mental health hotline being like, please help. And so, they were like, yep, for sure. Let's try something. They did like a telehealth appointment, got me all set up, and they're like, we'll get you in the queue, get you screened again. And so I get there one day with the psychiatrist. I'm like on the screen and he's like, hey, let's talk about like what you feel like you need help with, what's going on. And I was like, well, I wanted to do an ADHD screening because my executive dysfunction is gone. And he's like, Tori, it says here in your chart, you got screened for ADHD and diagnosed in 2015, 5 years ago. And I'd forgotten, like did not remember. I was just like, I had a newborn baby and a 2-year-old. I was in survival mode at that point too. And so I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe that, like, obvious. Yeah, cool. I was like, okay, well, thanks for the meds, I guess. They're helping.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And I like to talk to ex-evangelicals about this because like my experience, I got diagnosed in my 20s. My last semester of my postgraduate degree, which is like a really useful time to get diagnosed when you're done with school.
Okay.
And but I think where my ADHD probably showed up when I was 10, 11, when it was getting really bad, like there were so many rules. Both my parents were teachers, taught at the parochial schools. So like there were so many rules for me to stay like quote unquote good. Mm-hmm. And all these sort of fail safes to Jeremy, you clap the chalkboard erasers out, as I'm old enough to have actual chalkboards. And like I had all these extra rules and tasks where it's like, this kid can't sit still. Yeah. But because there was all these sort of extra curbs, and then I think all the extra rules of evangelicalism, I sort of reflect back and I was like, there was some functionality to that. But then when I hit my teens and went to college, it stopped being structurally helpful and became very restrictive.
Oh yeah. Nope. That makes perfect sense. I mean, I think that I was in kind of an interesting position because, I was homeschooled. I'm the oldest of 5 kids. And so there was like a decent amount of like free time, running around time. So I didn't have the same kinds of constraints as if I had gone to school. And so, I think that there was some flexibility there, and I don't want to say understanding because I think that's giving way too much credit, but like, my capacity was pretty well known in terms of my education. If you can call it that. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. It does. I feel like it's doing a disservice to myself when I say things like I was homeschooled K through 12, because like my parents didn't know how to teach me math. So I was homeschooled like K through 5.5 with math, right? Because
Sure.
it's like
Yeah.
that was those things just like weren't available. And so, I think there were like some pros, sure, I suppose, and also like a lot of cons to it. But then,
Yeah.
being a Black kid in an all white classroom in like suburban Portland might not have been good for me with who was like queer and ADHD and like, probably autistic, might not have been great for
Right.
me either. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
hard to say, but yeah, I think that for me, it didn't really become a major issue until, well, it didn't, I don't want to say a major issue. It didn't kind of stop me in my tracks until I had kids.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I could swing it, but I think that's very normal for people who are socialized female, right? That we can kind of swing the rules a little bit longer typically.
Yeah, well, and I think again, when we look at that normal bell curve of folks and functionality, and like I don't love that term. That is what we
Sure.
use in the mental health field of high
Right.
functioning. But like those high functioning folks tend to sort of brute brain strength their way through a lot of stuff, and so impairment doesn't necessarily show up the same way as
Yeah.
you do well enough to pass your standardized tests, or you do well enough to get your daily chores done, and so for me, like as a white kid at a white school, I was raised Lutheran,
Okay.
which is even evangelical, but like none of the fun stuff, not charismatic,
Oh, gosh.
very stoic,
Sure.
German, don't feel your
Sure.
feelings, evangelical. And so, I had all this like middle finger to the law sort of as that queer ADHD autistic kid growing up with no knowledge of that stuff then, like not knowing why I didn't fit in and why I disliked everything so much, even when everyone was like, look at you got all A+, good job, kid. And I was just sort
Mm,
of miserable with it. And so I think
yeah.
it's always interesting when I get to talk to other ex-evangelicals about like, hey, how's that rigid structure? When did
Yeah.
that break? Because like for a while, I think it keeps people in place, but it becomes
Right.
very restrictive very quickly.
That's so interesting, because I really sincerely thought that like it was like being Black was why I didn't fit in. And so I didn't need another explanation for it, because it was like
Yeah.
I was the only one in the room, right? And so it was just like, oh yeah, people treat me
Yeah.
weird, people treat me differently. It was very rarely cruel. I would
Yeah.
say like worst case scenarios for me typically were just being ignored, right? Which again, like someone like probably on the spectrum, most of the time I was fine with that anyway. I was like, I don't want to talk to you people. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that I didn't realize it because I had like these other factors at play
Yeah.
that were kind of like, oh yeah, like this is why I'm different. And so this is why I'm being treated different. And it just the layers there reflecting back on it
Yeah.
were really interesting. It's like,
Well, and I
oh,
think,
right.
yeah, I think again, just like it would be easy to say, let's talk about racism in the church, and that would give us a lot of content and fill up more time than we have.
Yes.
But I do like to bring up the neurodivergent piece, just because again, like as a white dude, like I'm who the privilege was designed for, and like it
Mhm.
never fit for me growing up ultra religious. Like I really sort of raged against that from a young age. Like I told my
Yeah.
parents when I was 10, I didn't want to go to heaven. Because I didn't like singing, and that's all I'd been told that heaven was.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and it's interesting. You talk and pretty open about your upbringing, growing up below the poverty line too. And
Mhm.
I think again, like when we look at that intersectionality, it is like privilege in the church is actually really, really, really limited to
Mhm.
predominantly like the white male leaders.
Yeah,
Like a lot of people aren't benefiting from the system.
right.
My parents were teachers at the Lutheran school, and we were like very poor. Like
Yeah.
my childhood, I remember like we spent hours cutting out coupons. Like that was a family activity. Otherwise, we couldn't afford our groceries.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was very much a part of it, right? I definitely was, there were all of these reminders of how we just had less than everyone else, which again makes me sort of wonder about like what would it have been like if I'd been at school, right? Because we didn't live in like a poverty-stricken area. We just had like a very inexpensive little apartment in the suburbs, and so which is so again, I'm like, I don't really know how that would have impacted, but I think in terms of how the privilege sort of trickles down or doesn't, it is really interesting. Like my co-host Justin on Go Home Bible You're Drunk talks about this a lot, right? Where he was technically in a position that like might have been considered fairly privileged and like in outside of a church context, but in church kind of is like, sure, maybe you get some more passes compared to other folks, but they're not really, like, as a neurodivergent person, they're not really benefiting you, because again, it's like there's all these unspoken rules and things that you're supposed to just catch, and sometimes you don't. And I think that that's really interesting because again, in a very white environment, a lot of the racism is something that you're supposed to just catch. You're supposed to just know it. But I was just like, again, had no clue that and when it did come up, when racist theology or ideas, because there were both for sure, did come up, I was just like, that doesn't track to like what I know about Jesus. That doesn't track to what I know about heaven, which again, I was in the same boat of like, I don't want to go to heaven. I'm going to see if I can talk my way out of it when I get there. And it was just like, I think you're just saying this, which it probably was not good for my faith.
Yeah. Right.
It was like, okay, I see what you're saying here. I like, sure, but I'm not reading that, right? And again, I was somebody who was like forced to read through the Bible every year. So I had a better, when people would come to me with stuff, I had a much better grasp on like the actual biblical sort of ideas, or again, not understanding it wasn't my place as a woman to be preaching or teaching out of the Bible. It was like, okay, but like, sure, you can say that, but also like, look at these verses, I probably should have just like listened to the white guys who were trying to tell me stuff. That hierarchy kind of just like was lost on me in a lot of ways. And so, it's fascinating the way that it played out for me, because it wasn't blatant for the most part. There were obviously blatant moments, but it was, and there were so many just confounding factors. I had no hope, I think, of staying in that system and continuing to just like skate by.
Right. Yeah.
What wasn't designed for me.
Right. What was sort of the formal, if there was a formal break for leaving? Was there I don't know. I think deconstruction's over so much time for so many people, but like, was there a like, this is my clear, obvious break?
Yes, absolutely. So before I got to that point, I spent a lot of time sort of wrestling with all of the anti-queer theology that I was taught. And again, I was like, I see what you're saying, and I see these verses that you're using, and it doesn't really line up with like, my understanding, my reading of again, it's like it's the Americanized English Bible, right? So we're many millennia and like multiple continents removed from like the original stories, acknowledging that. I really struggled with that. I figured out when I think I was like probably 18, 19 when I figured out that I was queer and like just didn't have any, it was like, I don't really, why would someone care what's in someone else's pants? Like that's weird to me.
Mhm.
You know, again, just like not getting it. Same with gender roles. And so I wrestled with that idea of like, I'm supposed to hate queer folks because God does. You know, we don't say that. We don't say God hates queer folks. We say
Yeah.
God loves queer folks so much he wants them to be straight and cis. But
Right. He
um,
loves them so much, he'll send them to hell if they're wrong.
right, exactly. And you know, and so I wrestled with that for like years, like a really long time. Pretty much daily was trying to figure out how do I make sense of this.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, I got to the thing that actually like ended up breaking for me was the Ferguson uprisings in the wake of Michael Brown being murdered in 2014.
Mhm.
And the like just the amount of like mask off racism that was in like my evangelical circles, because this was at a point where like, you know, everyone was on Facebook, right?
Yeah.
Everyone you knew was on Facebook every day, multiple times a day.
Yeah.
And so I saw everybody's unfiltered thoughts and I was like, oh, okay, well, this is easy. You've made this very easy for me. I will leave because I am not wanted here. Like,
Yeah.
it's very clear that like myself as an individual, my family, like we are not wanted in these spaces. I will help you all out and take off. Like hit
Yeah.
the road. And so that was really the thing for me. But like, so as I'm kind of processing that, which was actually incredibly traumatic, like took me many years to process, like just that experience.
Mhm.
I was also kind of going, okay, if if we all have to give an account for everything we do and I get to heaven, I was just like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give an account for I cut off people that God accepted. Like, absolutely not. I will not do that. And
Yeah.
so that kind of became a hard line for me. And then eventually I was just kind of like, yeah, this isn't really worth it. You know, I'm still
Yeah.
I still engage a lot with Christianity and the Bible, but in
Mhm.
terms of belief, it was like, yeah, I never wanted to go to heaven anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
I
yeah.
I relate to that. Um, Now, some of your work as an anti-racist educator, like working with church groups, working with religious organizations. I'm
Yeah.
curious, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you is have this conversation. I'm curious what you see for at least for folks who want to do better. Um, because I see so many Christians or progressive Christians or, recently deconstructed folks who, like, I would say have left the faith but kept the church in them,
Mhm.
and like sort of maybe don't like deconstruct things like colonialism and
Yeah.
imperialism and a lot
Yeah.
of that stuff. So I'm curious, sort of like, what's your read on that, and like, how do you sort of tackle some of that stuff as an anti-racist educator?
Well, truthfully, in like most of the contexts that I'm in, um, I feel like there's really, I kind of have sort of, I suppose I have like a limited set of tools that I can use in this context. But in something like, again, having a podcast every week can go a little bit deeper.
Hmm.
Where I don't know how many episodes we have, but we're coming up on 4 years for Go Home Bible, You're Drunk. And so I have the ability to kind of reflect more on the failure to deconstruct colonial kind of constructs and hierarchy. Authoritarianism is I found very jarring when I went on to, for example, like the ex-evangelical subreddit, and people were on there talking about, I quit going to church, I'm voting for Trump. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay, well, so why did you quit going to church? Like, well, so why? Like, those are your
Right.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I, for me, and I've had this I've had this moment in therapy myself where you get to that like kind of, I don't know, you get to that like moment. I don't know what you call it in therapy, right? But you have this sort of like ring of fire moment where you're like, whoa, look at all of this stuff that I have to unpack and heal from. This will take more than the number of years I have left in my life. This is way too much. And it's like a very humbling experience. And with like folks that with like friends that I've talked to, right? And for myself, you have this moment of like seeing yourself kind of clearly in this mirror for the first time and going, holy shit, look at all of this damage. This is so, I can't do this. And you get to this kind of like breaking point of like, I can't do this. This is too much for me to heal from in one lifetime. And that moment in therapy, I think, also kind of translates to anti-racism and like unlearning all of the social hierarchies that are put into your nervous system by existing in capitalism and evangelicalism, by existing in empire, right? And I think that I think I don't want to guesstimate how many people come to this moment, right? Like this really hard, cruel, crushing moment and then continue to move forward. I don't know. But I do know that when you're there, when you finally face kind of all of it at once and it feels really overwhelming and you want to shut down, that like that's a good sign. Right? Sort of just because it's been my experience, like it does sort of remind me of this moment when you're giving birth also of like, you get to this point where you're like, I don't think I can do this. I think we need to pull the plug. I don't know what that means, but like, I'm out of energy. I'm out of like being able to support myself in this moment. I don't think I can do this anymore. You know, so there are different places in life where we have these experiences. And I think that it is really essential to get to that point with, you know, racism, colonialism, capitalism, Christian supremacy, Christian nationalism, right? And to get so incredibly, to be so incredibly like humbled by that, the enormity of the work that's left to be done and to keep moving forward. And I think that that's sort of, I don't have a lot of language for it yet, but I'm realizing that that is something that not everybody does. And not everybody gets to that point.
Yeah.
And, you know, I do hope to be able to help more people through that because I think that you can get to that moment and go like, well, screw it, you know?
Yeah.
But you can also get to that moment and say, okay, what's the next thing to do? What's the next best thing I can do in this situation?
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating. And I don't have any extra insight. I think research around complex PTSD, religious trauma especially, is very lacking. It's brand new. It's going on right now, but we don't have a ton of research on it. Because I would be curious what the numbers, because I think a lot of people do get to that point and it's not an obvious outcome that people push through it and do the work. I think sometimes people kind of go, I got rid of the bad theology, so now I'm good.
Right.
And, you know, there's some, I hold some space, I guess. I don't agree with it, but I can understand the sort of path of least resistance that's available there, especially for white people deconstructing. Because I see a lot of deconstruction groups, and I'm not going to throw shade at anyone in particular, but like a lot of deconstruction groups that just sort of reform a church without a theology attached to it.
Yep. Yeah, it's true. And it's sad, right? Because it's like there's so much more freedom outside of this model that you've been given. And, you know, there are so many other kinds of frameworks that we can be exposed to and embrace and unlearn all of unlearn all of what we were taught because I don't think there are a lot of I mean, I think that there are things from Jesus that we can learn that still have value outside, but like in terms of evangelicalism, Jesus was just a means to an end, right? Like Jesus was just the sanctification that they slapped on their racist, sexist, misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic policies and ideas, just to sanctify them, to make them pure and holy. Had not, like, it didn't actually have anything to do with Jesus as a person, if you want to imagine him that way. But yeah, it does kind of, I guess, it is a little bit discouraging, right? When you see those, just people don't examine the structure, so they just recreate them outside of a church setting. Which is, again, like, that's not, we don't have to do it that way. There's so many ways to do it. And I love reading history, and part of why is because you learn some of the other ways that people have done things.
Yes.
And it's really kind of shocking and jaw-dropping in a lot of contexts, right? And it's like the people that were like demonized in our textbooks, for example, had all of these tools, right? That are just mind-boggling to us.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, we can try these new things, right? But I do, there is something, especially about evangelicalism, that's like very limiting, right? And there's something about capitalism that is very limiting in terms of our creative imagination.
Yeah. I mean, they play off of each other, certainly. But yeah, it is right. It's hard for people to imagine something different. Like, it is the water we swim in, especially capitalism. It's just like, it's hard to imagine anything else because people don't have that frame of reference.
Yep, absolutely.
I will also piggyback a little bit and say, like, shout out to reading history. A little bit of a pivot here, but like, living through fascist times, like, it's been very grounding for me to read other authoritarian regimes come and go. And like, again, I'm not minimizing the harm that is happening right now and will continue to happen under Trump, but like, some of the dooming that people are doing is like, well, humanity will continue to exist. America might not, but like, people still will.
Yeah.
And there's a grounding, like, hey, people have, and again, I don't mean to speak for all white people, but I will say to white people especially, like, other cultures have been resisting and doing it in community for a lot longer than we have. So with like so much love in my heart for recently deconstructed white people, like, we don't need to invent this. It already exists.
Yeah, absolutely. And something, I wish I could remember who said this. I should double down in my efforts to should redouble my efforts to find who said this. I at one point saw some content from an indigenous native person here somewhere in North America, and they were talking about the idea of the apocalypse, right? And the idea of the end of the world. And they were like, Native people have already experienced the apocalypse. Like, the apocalypse started when Columbus got here for us. The world has ended like that. The world has ended in so many ways for entire people groups, right? The world has ended, and indigenous people are still here, right? And they're still resisting fascism and authoritarianism in these really incredibly beautiful ways. And it was, again, as someone who was raised with like a huge amount of rapture anxiety, right? Like a huge amount of like end times anxiety, and who is the Antichrist, and are they going to make me take the mark of the beast? Like all of these things that it's like, oh, there are people alive right now who have experienced the apocalypse and lived to tell about it.
Yeah.
And I should be learning from those people.
Right. Yeah. And there's so much to learn. Like, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so we have, Milwaukee hosts the Hunting Moon Powwow every October. And it's, if you're in a majority group and you've never experienced being in a minority, it's very jarring to go to a powwow as a white person. And like I grew up on the black part of Milwaukee. So like I'm used to being the minority, and it was still a little weird to be like, oh, I don't think there's anywhere to sit here. But it's deeply ritualistic. It's steeped in community, and like there's so much joy in it.
Yeah.
And it's like, right, like again, for a community, for a group of people in the Midwest who like you can, all these places that are named still their indigenous names, and the tribes either don't exist or have no say in that anymore, to come together and have joy and have community. And I talk a lot about ritual in deconversion spaces, just because like, again, the church didn't create that. Humans have been doing ritual forever. But it's again, some of those things that I think people are talking about now with the Trump presidency have like been out there: community, mutual aid, like finding your joy and connecting to your community, doing things in ritual to protect your own peace. Like, those are really clear, obvious lessons from other communities that have gone through much worse times than this.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're right. I think that we're actually, in terms of people who have experienced like this, the rise of fascism and authoritarianism, and fear, we're some of the luckiest because we have the history books, right? And we have indigenous people and people, we can connect to anyone on the planet and learn from them and learn from their experiences, right? Because again, in a lot of other like cultural contexts, those histories are much more sacred, right? Whereas like whiteness is predicated on like erasing your cultural history and where you come from and your connection to land and your connection to humans, other humans. And so
there's not that cultural cachet, which I think is why like white people struggle with like sort of struggling to learn some of those other lessons, because they seem, again, I'll say foreign, because like for a lot of us, we didn't have it. I grew up German Lutheran. Like that doesn't mean very much growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Like I go to German Fest and I drink Jaeger, and like that's really it. I mean, like end of list. And so like there's not that cultural cachet, I think, for a lot of people. But and you're the anti-racist educator, so I don't want to do too many of my own talking points, but like I get fired up about this stuff because I see so many people in recent deconversion where it's like, if going to a powwow seems overwhelming, like Kendrick Lamar just won 5 Grammys, and like he talks about how Atlanta was a black mecca and was razed to the ground, and so was Tulsa in Oklahoma. Like stuff I think is readily accessible. System of a Down is talking about the Armenian genocide in their songs. Like there's groups of people, there's public figures who are talking about this stuff, who are putting it out there. It doesn't need to be, I don't know. I think it's good to do the work however you can right now. And I think sometimes people get caught up in like, well, this is too big of a project or like too big of a process. And like, nah, it's out there. Kendrick just won 5 Grammys like 2 days ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. And I know not everybody has like a natural, I suppose, I don't want to say proclivity, that's the wrong word, but like the natural sort of inclination to try to learn as much as possible from like every other group of people that's ever existed on the planet, like I do. But I do think that there are, like, again, really great resources and people that we can learn from, and books that exist now and research that's been done that can really help and inspire us to understand that there's like another world is possible. Like Andre Henry says, that there's like, oh yeah, there's other ways of thinking about this. There's other ways of existing. There's other ways of relating to one another. There's other ways of getting everyone's needs met. Right. We don't have to actually invent anything if we're willing to just sit down and listen.
Right. Yes. Which
I
think
think
that's hard for former evangelicals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is like sort of a component of whiteness, especially, right? And the example that I give all the time is that you will never, 400 years from now, there will never be a movie, let's say, right? There'll never be a movie about some high-powered, super successful attorney in Manhattan who gives up everything to go feed white babies in Kansas as an indigenous American person, right?
Right.
That won't ever exist because that narrative doesn't resonate with the whiteness at all. Like white
Right.
people are the saviors. And white people don't really need saving. Really, white women, sure, okay, like white kids maybe need to be rescued from people. But like, yeah, the narrative of like needing to be saved is very foreign to to white folks.
Right.
You know, like, and again, it's like there is sort of the Christianity piece of like you need your soul to be saved, but that's that, like in terms of like American Christianity and Christian nationalism, you yourself and your culture are fine. You're already sanctified. You already have like met all of the, you've already checked off all of the boxes. You've met all of the goals, right?
Right.
And yeah, I am constantly trying to learn as much as I can from indigenous people across the planet because the ways that they think about things are so antithetical to like the lens of whiteness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, to, you know, hopefully I'm assuming people who are listening understand like the difference between being a white person and whiteness is like a construct, but the way that like whiteness is sort of monoculture, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
whiteness is sort of like this field of soybeans for as far as the eye can see. Everyone is, but you have to be that crop, right? Or you get like cut down, torn out. And thinking about like the world as, you know, I'm lucky enough to live in the Pacific Northwest and that we have like this temperate rainforest here, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
just like beautiful and gorgeous and has thousands and thousands of different plants and animals and fungi and like in, can you imagine, right? Like I think about this all the time that like white folks, for example, came to like what is now Northern California and saw the redwood forest and were like, we should cut all this shit down, man. It's like,
Right.
whoa, like how are you in like such a magical place? And the first thing you think is, let's destroy this. Let's erase this from the planet, right?
Right.
And you know, the way that like and kind of examining the ways that whiteness sort of and capitalism sort of infect every aspect of research, for example, right? That for decades or centuries, you know, people thought that trees in the forest would compete with one another for sunshine. And it's like, nope, they're all sharing resources. Everybody gets what they need automatically. There's no like, you don't have to beg for nutrients if you were a tree in the forest. You just get what you need. They just show up there. And there's this whole system that like goes from like the roots all the way to the canopy of sharing whatever someone needs. And it's like, you know, our like scientists in the US especially had this idea that they were fighting one another like tech bros or like finance bros.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
That wasn't at all what was happening, right? And indigenous people were telling researchers this again for centuries. They're like, no, that's not like that. And it's like like the fact that we spend, I this is my guess, I suspect we have spent billions of dollars proving in a lab the stuff that indigenous people have been telling us since 1492.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then like the grossness that gets stacked on top, like wolves don't have an alpha. Like that's bad science. And so Andrew Tate teaching young men how to be alpha males is like so stupendously stupid.
And
but like
harmful.
again, yes, for sure. But like again, it's when you're in that, when you're raised in that, when you're raised in an empire, in imperial structure, like you don't, that sounds right. Like you don't necessarily have the wherewithal to be able to say like,
yeah,
that researcher who studied wolves for 2 months and didn't know anything about them might not know what he was talking about. Like, yeah, that it's a good place to deconstruct.
Yes, absolutely.
I do want to pivot a little bit. I know this is, gosh, what a time to be alive. As a millennial, just coming up on my third major economic crisis, once in a lifetime. But Donald Trump isn't going to cure racism just because he stops counting it. I think that's maybe his plan, like he had with COVID. What are you doing in your own life? How are you taking care of yourself? Obviously, your work is very, very relevant right now. And there's so much that I think is triggering around something like complex PTSD, around racism, around misogyny, around just fascism in general right now. So how are you sort of taking care of yourself? What do you do to find that balance to keep doing the work and also be a human yourself?
Yeah. I mean, my main thing that I've been yapping about for years at this point is hiking. It's just really grounding for me. And it's really funny how like I get to just I get to go and like be in a space, and then if I've been feeling discouraged, even for like maybe weeks up leading up to that point, and then I get back and I'm just like, whoa, I feel like myself again. Like it for me, being outside is magic. Like I know that there's science behind it, but like it functions in my nervous system as magic.
Right.
And so it's really wild that like I have, right before the new year, December was like pretty rough for me after daylight savings time. One of my kids has been like having some mental health struggles, and I wasn't spiraling, but I was like really like not in a good mental space at all. And I decided there was like this sunny day, like completely sunny day on the calendar in December, which is a big deal again in the Pacific Northwest. And I was like, we are going to the coast, which is, hour and a half from here. And I just like loaded my kids up. I filled the car up with like snacks and juice pouches, and we just drove out to the coast and hung out for a little bit, like explored shipwreck that's out there. And I just kind of like stood on this bluff for a while. I don't know how long it was, but it was long enough that my kids were like, can we go? And just like stared at the ocean. And like when I got back home, I was like, what happened to me? Like, I don't, it was really transformative in like a fairly small window, with a fairly minor amount of investment kind of on my end. So like, I know that's something that works really well for me. And I do try to encourage people, because even folks who are like, yeah, I'm not an outdoorsy type of person, like they'll go on a hike after, not having gone on one since they were a kid or whatever, and then come back and be like, whoa, that worked. That was weird how that worked.
Yeah.
Or just like going and sitting outside, like green space, blue space. That's kind of like my favorite, if I can do whatever I want to do. But there's other things, right? Like limiting my time on social media, especially before bed, is very helpful. And just doing something else, like listening to a podcast episode that I already know and love that isn't going to have some traumatic triggering thing in it. Or listening to a book. I try to do breath work like twice a day. Right when I wake up, immediately when I wake up, and right before I go to sleep. Also, like that is like really helpful for regulating for me. But I don't want to, I realize that like in my obsession with like outdoorsy, like healthy stuff, air quotes, that like video games and movies are like regulating for people, right?
Yeah.
I love like doing arts and crafts and making messes. Like my favorite thing in the world is when like there's glitter all over something from a project, which is very dysregulating for other people, but for me it's like,
right.
Yes, this is awesome. This is evidence that something amazing has happened here, right? And so I have a lot of practices, and as somebody with ADHD and no object permanence, I have to like write them down and then put them in a place where I remember to look at them. And
Yeah.
I try to go back over them several times a week so that when I'm in that moment of like, oh my God, this is too much, right? That I'm like, oh yeah, I have a list of tools that are available to me. I've done stuff like I've texted my best friends and I was like, hey, if I'm in a crisis, please like send me this list back to me so that I remember what I'm supposed to do, because I won't remember that I have skills or tools, right?
Yeah.
And then I would say the final thing is like being really intentional about spending time with my friends, aka community, whatever you want to call it, right? But that for me is they're like meditation and spending time with friends. I get to temporarily punch out of like Donald Trump being the president.
Yeah.
Right. That's just like not a thing. And I can just like be fully myself and have some and you know, I talked to Justin about this on Go Home Bible recently, but I'm like, I deserve a break. I deserve to have moments where Donald Trump is not the president. And like, again, for other people, that could be video games or crochet or, you know, being in the garden or what, you know, there's so many options, right, for things. You really have to just like kind of follow your own joy and like figure out what those things are.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been trying to be really intentional. Again, object permanence. If I'm not seeing people, I forget they exist. And so it's like, okay,
Right.
I'm gonna make a list, write down, hey, I want to see my people this month, and then text everybody, put something on the calendar, and like make sure that I make that happen, because it is really good for me to be able to just like clock out of the fascist authoritarian government that we're all living under right now, and to just like feed my own brain and soul, I guess. I don't know. I'm like, I don't use a lot of spiritual language, but whatever it is that you want to, whatever language you want to use, that is hugely important for me as a person.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, you know, however 200 as executive orders or whatever at, like, that's designed to set your nervous system on fire. But like capitalism is designed to keep you in a state of arousal that limits your ability to do things like protest or resist or take care of yourself and your community.
Yeah.
So, yes, you know, I love having people like you coming on who educate other people about this, and then like to hear you say, and I need to remind myself, because I think, right, like the knowledge isn't the point. Knowing it doesn't mean we get to check the box. We still have to do these things.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Tori, this has been great. I mentioned White Homework. I mentioned Go Home Bible. You're drunk. But if people want to work with you, if they want to learn from you, if they'd like to have you speak to one of their groups, how do they find you? How do they connect?
Yeah. So if you go online and just search Tori Glass, like my website will come up. Most of my social media will come up. You'll find the podcasts. And you can connect with me that way. My email address is hello@toriglass.com. Very easy. So if you wanted to shoot me an email, that's also great. I love collaborating with people on kind of whatever. Again, like ADHD, I'm like, everything is interesting to me, right? And so it's very rare that I'm gonna like look at something and be like, yeah, I don't know, that's probably not for me. You know, I'm always at least like really intrigued by like the work that people are doing. So if people want to connect in any way, that would be wonderful. You can go to whitehomework.com and get updates from me there as well. That's the Patreon for White Homework, obviously, but also post like free anti-racism resources and things like that. So you can sign up at any tier, even at a free tier, just so that you're getting notifications for like when stuff is happening and things like that. And but again, like if you just Google Tori Glass, you can find all of the things and find ways to connect. So
yeah, and we'll have the podcasts and your website and socials in the show notes too. So wherever you're listening to this podcast, drop down and check out those links there. Tori, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
And to all our great listeners, thanks for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.